To judge if this life is worth living is giving answer to the most fundamental question of philosophy. This is the question Albert Camus asks in the opening sentence of his essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. Written in 1942, the French writer, artist, and by some proclaimed philosopher, as Camus himself did not consider himself one, wrote this now infamous classic. Camus is trying to find an answer to the question if life is worth living, when inherently we know there is no true meaning in life. Camus coins this the most important and quintessential philosophical question, the only question that truly matters. Actually, he even goes a step further, claiming that all other questions in the history of philosophy are irrelevant in comparison to this one. Ethics, epistemology, metaphysics, they are but mere distractions if they do not seek an answer to this question. The essay is mostly known as an introduction to what Camus coined the absurd, and gave rise to the philosophy of Absurdism. But what does Camus mean with the absurd? Well, in short, every attempt to look at the meaning of life in an objective way always ends in absurdity. It is impossible to explain our life or the world around us with rationality or science, as they only create meaningless abstractions. And as Camus writes himself, a man that has become conscious of the absurd is forever bound to it. The absurd arises from the confrontation between the human who asks and the world that remains silent in an unreasonable manner. We long for clarity about our existence, but that clarity is not given to us. Questions that are unanswerable, such as what is the meaning of life, is there a divine plan, or is there an afterlife, are in essence unknowable with our limited comprehension. And although Camus did not coin himself an atheist, religion or God failed to provide him with a satisfactory answer, which brought him to the following. How should and can we live life if we cannot rely on anything? If we cannot know the true meaning of life, and it appears that there is none, how can we relate to the absurdity of our own existence? That is the question Albert Camus presents to us in The Myth of Sisyphus. Influenced by the philosophical ideas of thinkers like Søren Kierkegaard, Arthur Schopenhauer and Friedrich Nietzsche, Camus contends that life lacks inherent meaning, despite humanity's persistent efforts to impose order and seek answers to unanswerable questions. Drawing inspiration from the ancient Greek myth of Sisyphus, who is eternally tasked by the gods to roll a boulder up a hill, only for it to roll back down, Camus employs this allegory to illustrate humanity's perpetual struggle against life's inherent absurdity. According to Camus, the initial step towards dealing with this absurdity is to acknowledge its existence. If, akin to Sisyphus, death is not a viable option, the only recourse is to rebel by finding fulfillment in the very act of pushing the boulder upwards for eternity. In this video, we will explain and outline the main ideas of the essay. Note that we will offer our own subjective interpretation of this essay, and, of course, there are other interpretations that are also possible, so be sure to let us know what you think in the comment section below. The Myth of Sisyphus consists of the following 4 parts. The first part, which is titled An Absurd Reasoning, a second part titled The Absurd Man, a third part titled Absurd Creation, and last but not least, the fourth and final part, which is titled The Myth of Sisyphus. Part 1. An Absurd Reasoning. In the opening of the essay, Camus delves into the fundamental question of human existence, which he calls the absurd. As explained earlier, the absurd is born out of our confrontation with the meaninglessness of life. As humans, we are creatures driven by an innate longing for happiness and a rational understanding of the world around us. Yet, when we confront the vastness of the cosmos, we are met with an unsettling silence, an irrational void that defies our attempts to find meaning. Imagine a traveler wandering through a dense forest, guided by the flickering light of his flashlight and the hope of discovery. But as the traveler journeys deeper, he finds himself ensnared in a labyrinth of chaos and uncertainty, where the very fabric of reality seems to mock his quest for understanding. The clash between our innate desire for meaning and the indifferent, chaotic nature of the universe gives rise to the absurd. It's not merely a matter of human irrationality or cosmic randomness, but rather the inherent contradiction between our quest for meaning and the stark reality of existence. The absurd emerges as the silent dialogue between humanity's longing for purpose and the enigmatic silence of the universe. It's a paradoxical dance that leaves us teetering on the edge of reason, grappling with the profound mystery of our own existence. So what should we do? Or put differently, what can we do to cope with the absurd? Camus observes that other philosophers tried to grapple with the absurd, only to find their paths leading to what he terms philosophical suicide. This curious phenomenon entails embracing an irrational belief in objective meaning despite the inherent absurdity of existence. One example Camus mentions is Kierkegaard's proposition when faced with the absurd. He advocates for a leap of faith, referring to God, urging us to abandon reason and morality in favor of a predetermined moral framework, essentially asking us to ignore the absurd, hence Camus coining it a form of philosophical suicide. Camus dismisses such notions as inadequate responses to the absurd. So, what remains? Well, Camus posits another option, embracing the absurd. This entails a courageous confrontation with the inherent chaos and meaninglessness of existence, leading to three transformative outcomes: revolt, freedom, and passion. Embracing the absurd grants us the realization of true freedom, untethered by the constraints of imposed meaning, an invitation to seize the richness of life's experiences without the burden of preconceived notions or unnecessary moral frameworks, as in the example of Kierkegaard. But how does one go about this daunting task? This question serves as the gateway to the second part of the essay, The Absurd Man, where Camus delves deeper into the practical implications of embracing the absurd and living authentically in a world devoid of inherent meaning. Here, Camus notes that for the absurd man, it's not about explaining or solving anything, but about experiencing. Everything starts with indifference. This indifference encompasses everything from an indifference against our moral systems, such as religion or a type of ethics, to the opinion of others. When we detach from these abstractions, we break free from the chains of suffering. Camus here verges on a form of Stoicism in a sense, where removing significance brings relief from most forms of anguish. By shedding significance, we not only lighten our load of suffering from the absurd, but also gain greater freedom in our choices. This opens up the possibility to a form of unrestrained agency. Camus gives us three archetypes that describe how man should live once being confronted with the reality of the absurd. The three archetypes are the Don Juan, the actor, and the conqueror. The first archetype, the Don Juan, or as I like to call him myself, the playboy, is a seducer. He does not care about a greater meaning in life or an afterlife. He is simply a chaser of the daily enjoyments he finds in life, virtually living his life without a worry on his horizon. Would you recognize in this individual a constant state of misery or unhappiness? Don Juan chooses a life of passion and excitement, with a perpetual smile gracing his lips. Don Juan acknowledges there exists no noble love except that which acknowledges its own brevity and uniqueness. Next, we have the second archetype, the actor, which is an interesting archetype because the actor for Camus symbolizes someone that lives through the character he is portraying on stage. He is playing a role and loses his own sense of self, well knowing that the character he is portraying is temporary and will, metaphorically speaking, die once the role is finished. The actor gives it his all during his performance, which can be linked to the transformative outcome of passion. The third and last archetype is the conqueror. For the conqueror, overcoming the absurd is not merely about achieving wealth, status, or even recognition. Instead, it is about embracing the relentless pursuit of goals, the thrill of overcoming obstacles, and the satisfaction of continuous growth. Much like Sisyphus endlessly pushing the boulder up the hill, the conqueror finds fulfillment in the journey itself, rather than in any ultimate destination. An important side note here is that for Camus, these archetypes are just hypothetical examples. They are not necessarily meant to be applied in life literally. He does not want them to be granted the status of an ideal, but wants to use them to clarify his point. Another important note is that the absurd man, in whatever form he comes, is amoral. Either morality comes from something transcendent, like God, or it is invented as a system by humans in order to justify certain kinds of behavior. The absurd man does not believe in God, and he has no need for moral justification. He is led solely by his own sense of integrity, which stands independent of any moral framework. Since the absurd man operates outside the bounds of morality, free from notions of guilt or wrongdoing, Camus characterizes him as innocent. The distinction between the absurd man and the rest of humanity lies not in his actions, but in his internal perspective towards them. For instance, the difference between Don Juan and an average seducer is not primarily in their behavior, but in their attitude towards that behavior. An ordinary seducer might be accused of the same faults that Camus defends Don Juan against. The difference being that for Don Juan, there is nothing beyond the act of seduction itself. He does not seduce to find love or to alleviate melancholy. He seduces purely for the pleasure of seduction. Don Juan embodies the absurd man by recognizing that his life lacks inherent meaning and that his actions hold no significance beyond their immediate consequences. Camus labels the absurd man innocent, to contrast it against the Christian idea of sin. In Catholic belief, everyone is born a sinner, marked by the original sin of Adam and Eve. A Christian lives with a continual consciousness of sin and guilt, striving to earn forgiveness and gain entry into heaven or the afterlife. The Christian life is centered between our innate evil and our potential for good. In contrast, the innocence of the absurd man eliminates any sense of sin or guilt. His actions and decisions are not overshadowed by a fear of divine judgment or the idea of a struggle between good and evil. He experiences no internal restraints preventing him from pursuing his desires. In this way, the absurd man's innocence also reflects a certain integrity. He lives a life aligned with his interests and desires, without needing any moral code beyond. Part 3. Absurd Creation. In the third part of the essay, Camus points out that expressive forms such as art help us to express the absurdity of life. However, he also points out that these expressions cannot add inherent value to our life. They can only be a means to an end. So art, in a sense, helps us shape our existence. The notion that art imitates life has been prevalent since Aristotle's time. The Greeks called this concept mimesis, a term from which the English word mime is derived. Camus likely references this Greek idea when he describes the absurd man as performing a mime of life, viewing the act of creation as the ultimate form of this imitation. This embodies the essence and the ideal of the absurd man, as we should not hope to find a logical explanation for life. That is something neither philosophy, religion, or science can ever provide us, let alone art. However, art symbolizes the revolt, the creative aspect of one's own perspective on the world. As Camus writes himself, the only way to deal with an unfree world is to become so absolutely free that your own existence is an act of rebellion. As a case study, Camus explores the work of Dostoevsky, and more specifically his novel The Possessed. In this novel, Dostoevsky wrestles with the notion that life is either filled with meaning because of God's existence or utterly pointless without him. Unlike philosophers who deal with abstractions of this question, Dostoevsky, as a novelist, delves into how these metaphysical concerns impact our individual lives. In this novel, the character Kirillov embodies this struggle. He wants to revolt against the idea that God doesn't exist. Kirillov embodies this struggle. He argues that for life to have purpose, God must exist. But he cannot reconcile this belief with the conviction that God does not exist. Kirillov ends his own life, not as an act of despair, but as a bold rebellion against the idea of a godless universe, an attempt to assert ultimate freedom by becoming his own God. He wants himself, in a certain sense, to become God. It's precisely this absurd reasoning that makes Dostoevsky an author that understands the absurd. Camus interprets this to mean that in a world without God, individuals assume the role of determining their own fate. Without divine oversight, human actions are guided purely by personal will. However, many people cling to hope and fail to embrace this absolute freedom. Kirillov serves as a radical demonstration of the complete freedom available to humans. Despite presenting an absurd perspective through Kirillov and other characters, Dostoevsky ultimately rejects the full implications of absurdism and turns to fate. In his final novel, The Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky concludes with Alyosha affirming belief in an afterlife, revealing his ultimate fate in God. Camus notes that while Dostoevsky engages deeply with themes of absurdity, he ultimately aligns more with existentialism, choosing fate over the acceptance of a meaningless universe. We saw the same reasoning in chapter 1 with philosophers like Kierkegaard. This chapter extends that idea, showing that Dostoevsky, as a writer, mirrors this pattern. Recognizing the absurd doesn't necessarily lead to creating literature that reflects it entirely. Part 4. The Myth of Sisyphus. The biggest part of the absurd is our everyday existence. The absurd person is someone who has seen through the ridiculous repetitions of daily life. Rising, streetcar, 4 hours in the office or factory, meal, streetcar, 4 hours of work, meal, sleep, and Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, according to the same rhythm. This path is easily followed most of the time, but one day the why arises, and everything begins in that weariness tinged with amazement. Camus associates this repetition of daily life to the Greek myth of Sisyphus. Sisyphus was the king of Ephyra, today known as Corinth. He was also a horrible tyrant that killed others for his own pleasure. He was condemned by the gods to the worst punishment imaginable to men, a punishment that other philosophers such as Heidegger would coin worse than death itself: to roll a boulder up a hill only for it to roll back down once he reached the top of the hill, over and over again, for eternity. Bound to a life of perpetual struggle, his task rendered futile, his existence devoid of significance. Yet, he finds solace in his defiance. For Camus, Sisyphus emerges as the emblem of the absurd hero, one who embraces life in its entirety, defying death, despite being forever chained to a task devoid of meaning. We are all Sisyphus, engaged in the repetitive grind of our existence. We all laboriously push our individual burdens only to witness their inevitable descent back into insignificance. The true absurdity of our existence lies in our conscious recognition of this Sisyphean condemnation. Nevertheless, Camus does not advise us to succumb to despair. He envisions Sisyphus confronting his destiny with defiance as he descends the hill to recommence his arduous task. In these fleeting moments of liberation, when he transcends his fate and asserts dominance over his burden, Sisyphus becomes not only a prisoner of eternity, but a rebel. Despite the seeming futility of our daily struggles, we grant them with significance and meaning, thus granting our lives meaning amidst the absurdity. Through the myth of Sisyphus, Camus undertakes the monumental task of analyzing the essence and meaning of life. Yet, rather than delving into metaphysical or overly abstract explanations, he observes the occasional onset of absurdity, urging us to heed his analysis of a shared state of mind. His focus remains fixed on the question of how to live and attain happiness. Camus concludes, "I leave Sisyphus at the foot of the mountain. One always finds one's burden again, but Sisyphus teaches the higher fidelity that negates the gods and raises rocks. He too concludes that all is well. This universe, henceforth, without a master, seems to him neither sterile nor futile. Each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountain, in itself forms a world. The struggle itself toward the height is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy." Camus contends that the absurd hero perceives life as a relentless struggle devoid of hope. Denying or avoiding this struggle and its inherent hopelessness is a way to escape from the absurd contradiction of existence. For Camus, the essential requirement for the absurd man is to live with a full awareness of his absurd situation. As Sisyphus pushes his rock uphill, he experiences only toil and struggle. But during his descent, he is aware of his endless and futile struggle. This awareness mirrors the mindset of the absurd man, who knows his efforts are ultimately pointless. As long as Sisyphus remains conscious of this, his fate is no worse than our own. We only react with dread to Sisyphus' fate due to its evident futility and despair. Camus argues that life itself mirrors this pointless struggle without any promise of hope. Yet, he also implies that his fate is dreadful only as long as we continue to hope for something more worthwhile. Our predicament appears terrible when contrasted with an imagined better alternative. If we abandon the notion of a preferable existence, we can accept our fate without fear. In doing so, Camus suggests, we can truly embrace life without any illusions. Sisyphus transcends his fate precisely because he has embraced it. His ordeal becomes dreadful only if he continues to hope for or dream of a better condition. Without hope, the gods have no means to torment him. While Camus differs from Nietzsche in many ways, his inspiration to Nietzschean philosophy is very evident here. Exploring tragedy, Camus notes that Sisyphus' awareness of his fate renders it tragic. He references Oedipus, who becomes a tragic figure upon realizing his actions. Both characters ultimately find happiness by concluding that all is well. Camus implies that tragedy is not pessimistic, but represents a human triumph. Recognition and acceptance of our fate and limitations lead to true heroism. Tragic fate seems terrible, only when contrasted with hope for something more. By abandoning hope, Sisyphus does not perceive his fate as dreadful, but finds genuine happiness. Camus concludes that happiness and absurd awareness are closely linked. True happiness arises when we accept our life and fate as entirely our own. If happiness required escaping reality through hope or fate, it would be a false happiness born out of denial. The myth of Sisyphus aims to show that happiness can be found in accepting our experiences without relying on illusions. Therefore, if genuine happiness is possible, Sisyphus must be happy. While we've covered the key aspects of the myth of Sisyphus, watching a video about Camus cannot replace the experience of reading his work firsthand. As the Italian saying goes, traduttore traditore. To translate or interpret is to betray. Our interpretations can introduce imprecisions due to personal biases and perspectives. I strongly recommend reading The Myth of Sisyphus yourself. You can find a link to the book in the description below, along with links to some of Camus' other works. Did you enjoy this video? If so, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe for more content. Also, let us know in the comments which philosopher, thinker or author you'd like us to explore next. Your feedback helps us bring you the content you want to see. We are here to serve you philosophy. Thank you for watching and we will see you in the next video. Take care.